Hello and welcome. I'm Brian, the Clueless Guru, and today we're going to be talking about SSH tunneling. SSH tunneling is a great technique that you can use if you have access to an SSH server on a network that you don't normally have access to. So, for example, if you have a situation where you have a machine that is outside of the network, let's say your Kali instance, and you want to be able to do something inside of another network, but you can't directly access that resource. What you can do is you can use SSH tunneling to access a server that, for example, is being NATed through the firewall, and you can SSH directly into that host that's inside of that network. And then from there, have that host forward on your connections to your target machine. Another technique is going to be if you are within that network and you want an outside system to be able to access certain resources within that network, but the outside system can't just directly SSH in. We're going to look at a technique where we can SSH to that outsider box and have it forward on the connections on its behalf and be able to have that outside machine communicate to the internal network. And then the third thing we're going to cover is going to be setting up a dynamic proxy using SSH, one of my favorite techniques. And if you stick around, afterwards, we'll also maybe talk about a bonus application to set up your SSH tunneling to be more like a VPN. So first, what we're going to do is we are going to quickly talk about our scenario. I'm going to diagram it out, and then we'll jump into our lab environment and actually check it out. Here's what our lab environment looks like right now. As you'll see, we have the internet coming into a network where we have our Kali instance simulating to be on the external network, and the pfSense box, a firewall, which is a bastion between the external network and the internal network. And so the 192.168.93 network is going to be our external, and the 10.network is going to be our internal. So our target right now is to go from our Kali box over to the Metasploitable box on port 80. So what we're going to do is create that tunnel that I mentioned. So from the Kali box, we're going to go through the Ubuntu server over to Metasploitable, port 80. So we'll lay out these commands. The command that we're going to run is going to be SSH-L port 8080. So this port 8080 is an arbitrary port that we specified. This is going to be the port that is going to be listening on the Kali machine, and it can be any port that you want as long as you have permissions to establish that port. Then it is going to connect over to the Ubuntu server. We log in with our account, and then it's going to forward that connection over to Metasploitable on port 80. So let's visualize this a little bit more. So we take our command SSH-L and we run that in Kali. Then Kali is going to take that -L 8080 and is going to listen on that port. Kali will then SSH over to the Ubuntu server and log in. And then we're going to have the SSH server, the Ubuntu server, forward the connection over to Metasploitable on port 80. Once that handshake and everything is complete, then we will open up a browser and we'll point to localhost 8080. So let's try it out. Let's jump into our console here, and we are running a standard Kali build, and SSH is going to be installed by default. Our browser is going to be installed by default. And so let's jump into a terminal and run our command. So just as before, SSH-L, the port we want to listen to, 8080, where we want the server to forward us onto, which is going to be 10.0.0.14. And that's going to be the Metasploitable IP address internally. And this information has been gathered through other information discovery techniques that we did outside of this video. And so from here, we also want to point over to port 80, which is going to be the HTTP server that is listening on the Metasploitable box. And then we will log in as our user. And in our case, we have our connection being NATed through the pfSense firewall over to the Ubuntu server. So we have to use the firewall's external IP address on port 22 to connect to the Ubuntu server that's inside the network with the 10 dot address. And so that address for us is going to be 192.168.93.133. And so from here, we will be prompted to log in. If this is your first time connecting to this machine with SSH, you will be prompted to verify the SSH signature. If you're okay with it, you'll type in yes and hit enter. So we'll put in our password here. This technique also works if you need to use an identity file, which is like an SSH key, and authenticate that way as well. Instead of username and password, it can be a username and key, or all of the above. Okay, so now that we're logged in, you can see that it was a successful login, and we're going to open up another terminal just so we can take a look at the netstat to confirm that port 80 is listening. So I'm going to throw on a couple extra flags just to shorten our list. So we're going to say listening TCP and just show us the numbers. And so here we can see that port 8080 is listening. And now this entire tunnel has been set up just like we laid out in the diagram. So let's open up our Firefox or any web browser on our Kali machine. And then we will connect to HTTP 127.0.0.1 on port 8080. Great. So now we can see we have access to our Metasploitable machine on port 8080. As far as the browser is concerned, it's on the same machine. But thanks to that SSH tunnel, we are now traversing into another network onto another host. So we see that SSH L allows us to connect directly into the network through an SSH server and forward on our connections. But what if we run into a scenario that we don't have direct access from our external machine, in our case our Kali machine, to be able to access the network directly? If we have access to that Ubuntu server through other means, whether it's being on the network internally, we can actually have that SSH jump box that we want to use connect out to our Kali machine, assuming our Kali machine can receive connections on port 22 across that network. So what we'll do from the Ubuntu server is we're going to run the SSH-R command, and we're going to have it connect back to our Kali machine, and at the same time forward any connections to that local port on the Kali machine through that SSH server over to our destination machine and port, which is going to be Metasploitable on port 80 again. So let's take a look at this visually. So we take our connection, we have our SSH server, our Ubuntu server, is going to connect back to our Kali instance, and then from the Ubuntu server over to Metasploitable on port 80. So this is our command that we're going to run. Very similar to SSH-L. This is going to be SSH-R, port 8080. Again, this is an arbitrary port that we define as long as we have permissions to open up that port. This will be the port that's going to be listening on our Kali instance. And then the Metasploitable port 80, that's going to be the destination that we want that tunnel to end at. And then the user at, in this case, Kali, this is saying that from this machine, we're going to connect over to the Kali instance. So let's kind of walk through this flow in the diagram. So we take our command and we run it on the Ubuntu server. And then the Ubuntu server will then SSH over to Kali. From there, Kali will listen on port 8080. And then the Ubuntu server is going to forward any connections over to Metasploitable on port 80. And then, just as before, we'll open up a browser and we'll point to localhost 8080. So let's jump into our consoles and run these commands and actually see it in action. So as I mentioned, we are on the Ubuntu server on that internal network, and we will run that command. So we'll run SSH-R port 8080, and this will be that arbitrary port that we picked, and we're going to have it connect over to our Metasploitable box again, which is going to be 10.0.0.14, and that's going to be on port 80. And then we will connect over to our Kali box, and that address, let's jump over there really quick and grab that. is going to be 192.168.93.128. So we'll run that, and our Kali instance isn't currently listening on port 22. So let's start up that service. And let's try that again. Great, so we are prompted for our password. And just like before, we can do identity files or whatever we need to do. So if we jump over to our Kali instance and take a look, just like before, netstat, listening, TCP, just showed numbers only. And we can see that port 8080 is listening again. So from here, we will open up our Firefox and we will have it connect to HTTP 127.0.0.1 port 8080. And we can see again, we are connected to our Metasploitable box and we can navigate through there as if we were directly connected. So finally, we set up our local option, we set up our remote option, but the third option we have is to set up a dynamic proxy, a SSH proxy. And what this is going to do is it's going to set up a listener on our Kali machine, and it's going to connect over to our Ubuntu server. And from there, we tell our browser or any proxy-aware application, such as proxy chains or browsers or some other techniques, you can tell it to access an internal address on that foreign network, and it will automatically forward over to that IP and to that service that you need to connect to. So let's take a look at our diagram again. This is going to be similar to the first scenario, except we are going to have our Kali box still connect to the Ubuntu server. And when we tell the browser to connect, we're going to have it connect over to Metasploitable port 80. But another option is to have it go anywhere we want within the network, so long as it's TCP or possibly UDP. So here's what we're going to focus on. This is our command. This is going to be SSH-D to set up for the dynamic proxy. We specify an arbitrary port to be listening on our Kali machine. And just like the port 8080 before, this can be any number you have privileges to open up. And most commonly for a SOCKS proxy is going to be 1080. And then we log into our remote server just as normal. So just like before, let's walk through it graphically so it makes sense. So we're going to take our command, SSH-D, and we are going to put that to our Kali instance. And from there, Kali is going to listen on port 1080, SSH over into the Ubuntu server. And from there, we're going to open up our browser. We're going to configure it to use the SOCKS proxy. And then we're going to tell it to navigate to that internal IP address on port 80. And it will dynamically forward that connection right on over to that host and port. So again, we'll jump into our terminal and we'll do SSH-D port 1080. And our username and just a reminder, we're connecting to the external interface on the firewall, which will forward our connection over to the Ubuntu server. And log in just as usual. And now you can see that we're logged in. So to confirm, just open up a new terminal and we'll do netstat -L for listening, T for TCP connections, and N to show just the numbers. And we can see that port 1080 is listening. Great. So let's open up a browser and let's configure Firefox, in this case, to use a SOCKS proxy. One technique too is to use the add-on Foxy proxy, or another favorite tool to handle jumping around between different types of proxies a lot quicker. But let's just jump into the preferences. And up in the Find Preferences, makes it much quicker just to search for proxy and click on Settings. we'll do a manual proxy configuration, and we'll jump down to the SOCKS host, and we'll connect to 127.0.0.1, and we'll specify port 1080. And so it'll be a SOCKS version 5 connection. And then we also have an option of proxying the DNS when we use SOCKS version 5. For today's example, we don't need to enable it, but depending on your use case, you might be able to leverage that to use the internal DNS inside of that network. So we'll leave that not checked for our use case, but that's something to consider for your situation. And we'll click on OK. So great. Now let's jump over to a tab, and we are going to go to http:// that internal address of the metasploitable box, which is going to be 10.0.0.14. And if we want, we can specify port 80. And so then we'll navigate there. And here we are, connected directly to that metasploitable machine on port 80 from our machine that's outside of the network. So you saw 3 opportunities to route your traffic from an external host through an internal network, whether that is directly from the external machine, SSHing to a machine inside the network, and using that as a pivot point. Option 2 was to have that internal machine connect out to our Kali instance and still use that server as a pivot point into the network. And then the third option was our Kali machine SSH directly into that Ubuntu server and was able to pivot throughout the network and can access different things. So this is a great tool, a great technique. Some caveats that you need to be aware of are going to be SSH operates at a higher level in the OSI model, which means that it can only perform full TCP connections. So for situations where you need to use something like Nmap, and if you're not familiar with Nmap, check out my other video. But if you're using Nmap, you need to specify to do a full TCP scan, so -S. You are not able to do a SYN scan or a half-open TCP connection. And also, you are not able to do pinging, which uses the ICMP protocol, which is even lower on the OSI model. And if you're using Nmap, the application will just not work. So you have to specify -P, lowercase n, to say don't ping. The catch with that is that when you specify -P, lowercase n, that means you're treating every host as alive. So if you're going to be doing a port scan, it's going to scan every single IP address, whether it's up or not, and it's going to check for every single port that you've specified, which can take a long time. So that may be what you want to do, or another option would be to look at using maybe an internal tool on the network that you'll be scanning from. So now that you've stuck with me this long, let's take a look at another tool that allows you to use this SSH tunnel similarly as a VPN. You're going to have the same caveats as the other SSH methods, where it comes to it has to be full TCP connections and you cannot be doing any pinging or ICMP type of traffic. So this is where we introduce sshuttle or shuttle. And this is a tool that is not installed on Kali by default. So what we'll do is we'll jump into our Kali instance and let's get it installed, and we'll run it for the first time. So let's jump into our Kali instance and let's download and install our SSH shuttle. And luckily it's actually built into the repos, and so we can simply just do sudo apt install sshuttle. Quick and painless. And so if we take a look here at the help menu, you can see that there's a lot of options that we can pick from. So what we're going to do is we're just going to kind of jump into the bare minimums. And what's really cool about Shuttle is the technique that it uses. It will update your IP tables and will handle automatic routing to these networks. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to set it up where we're going to say take all of our connections and just run it through that SSH tunnel. Take a look at the documentation for Shuttle if you want to narrow it down to the specific subnets that you're connecting to and a few other nice features. This is just a quick introduction to Shuttle, and the rest will be up to you to learn. So let's run through an example. So going back to our network diagram, we are at our Kali instance, and we are going to be connecting over to Metasploitable again. And we will use Shuttle to connect us through the Ubuntu server, and it'll essentially forward on our connections as needed. Okay, so we will run our command, which is going to be shuttle -v for verbose, so we can kind of get an idea of what it's doing under the hood. -r for the remote host that we want to connect to. The username we'll be connecting as, and the external IP for the firewall, which has that natting in place that's going to connect us directly to our Ubuntu server. And then we need to specify the network that we want to route for us. And so in this case, it's going to be the 10 network. And so we'll specify 10.0.0.0/24. And this basically means that we want anything that is going to 10.0.0.1 through 254 to go through this connection. And so we'll hit enter, and we'll be prompted to log in to the SSH server. And now we can see that we have a bunch of IP tables that are set up with the type of NAT, and it's going to be handling redirecting our traffic over to the 10 network. And so we'll open up a browser, and without any proxies or anything configured, we will navigate over to our Metasploitable machine, which is going to be 10.0.0.14 on port 80. And so now we can see we have access to the internal network and to the resources inside of that network from our Kali box, which is on the outside. So look up that command and check out some of the other options. You can also do DNS forwarding through there and check that out. And so with that, you saw 4 opportunities for SSH tunneling. And it's a lot to learn, and it's a lot to take in. It's a fun technique. This can be something that you can use as a security researcher, red team situation, or penetration tester. But also if you are just looking to navigate around from network to network without having to deal with extra firewall rules and whatnot, so long as you have permission to do all of these activities. Otherwise, you may find yourself into some trouble. So with that, I'm Brian, the Clueless Guru. Let's continue to learn together and secure our world one command at a time.